The stagecoach lurches to a halt, dust billowing like a phantom from its wheels. From his vantage point near the dusty, sun-baked platform of the Harmony Creek station, Silas Blackwood watches, his weathered face betraying little of the knot tightening in his gut. This is it. The arrival of Elara, the woman who answered his advertisement, the woman he hopes will ease the profound solitude of his remote ranch. He sees her then, a small figure hesitantly descending, clutching a worn carpet bag. She's younger than her letter suggested, and there's a fragility about her that makes his calloused hands clench. As she steps fully into the unforgiving sunlight, her condition is undeniable, even beneath the modest cut of her traveling dress. She is with child, and clearly far along. The station master, a portly man named Henderson, with eyes that miss nothing and a tongue that wags accordingly, lets out a low whistle, a sound that cuts through the quiet afternoon sharper than any whip crack. Elara flinches, her gaze dropping to the dusty planks beneath her feet, her face pale. Silas feels a muscle jump in his jaw. This wasn't in the letters, not a whisper of it. He sees the dawning pity, the scorn, the judgment in Henderson's eyes, and a cold fury begins to build in him, a protective instinct he hasn't felt in years. Elara looks up, her eyes, wide and haunted, finally meeting his. There's fear there, but also a desperate, pleading hope. The baby. He hadn't bargained on a baby. He'd bargained for a companion, a helpmeet, someone to share the silence. But as he looks at her, small and terrified, bearing the weight of the world and another life within her, something shifts inside him. It's not pity, not entirely. It's something sterner, something akin to a sudden, unexpected responsibility. He clears his throat, his voice rougher than usual. "Miss Elara?" She nods, a barely perceptible movement. He sees Henderson smirking, already composing the gossip that will soon be the talk of Harmony Creek. Silas takes a step forward, his shadow falling over her. He glances at her belly, then back to her frightened face. The words come out, quiet but firm, carrying over the sudden hush that has fallen. He needs a father, and with that simple pronouncement, a life he thought was set in stone cracks wide open, and the silence of his ranch is about to be filled with more than he ever imagined. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The journey to Silas Blackwood's ranch was a silent one, punctuated only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the rhythmic plodding of his sturdy mare, Bess. Elara sat beside him on the rough wooden seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the unending expanse of prairie that stretched before them. The wind, dry and persistent, whipped strands of her dark hair across her face, but she made no move to brush them away. She felt suspended in a strange limbo, a reprieve she hadn't dared hope for. The station master's leering face, the whispers she'd imagined even before they were spoken, had prepared her for outright rejection, for being cast back into the desolate unknown from which she'd barely escaped. But this man, Silas Blackwood, had not turned her away. His words, "He needs a father," echoed in her mind, a strange and unsettling pronouncement. What did it mean? Was it kindness? Or was it merely a pragmatic rancher seeing a future hand, a small boy to eventually help with the never-ending work? She stole a glance at him. His profile was stark against the vast sky, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed against the sun's glare. He was older than she'd pictured from his brief, formal letters, lines etched deep around his eyes, and mouth spoke of hardship and time spent alone under this same unforgiving sky. He hadn't asked a single question about her condition, about the child's true father, about the circumstances that had led a pregnant young woman to seek a stranger through a mail-order bride advertisement. His silence was a heavy blanket, comforting in its lack of accusation, yet unnerving in its opacity. Silas, for his part, was wrestling with a maelstrom of his own. He'd been a solitary man for 10 years, since Martha, his wife, had been taken by the fever. The silence of the cabin, once a companion, had grown into a suffocating presence. His advertisement had been a desperate act, a last attempt to reclaim some semblance of human connection. He'd envisioned a sturdy woman, someone capable and perhaps a little lonely herself, who could share the burdens and the quiet companionship of ranch life. He had not envisioned this. A girl, really, barely out of her teens, carrying another man's child. The shock had been profound. Yet, standing on that platform, seeing the blatant scorn on Henderson's face and the raw terror in Ilara's eyes, something had snapped within him. It was an old, buried instinct to protect the vulnerable, to stand against the petty cruelties of the world. His declaration about the child needing a father had surprised even himself, a defiant retort to the judgment he saw forming. Now, the reality of his impulsive words settled upon him like the prairie dust. A baby. Crying, needing, helpless. His spread was modest, barely wrested from the stubborn land. Could he provide for them? Did he even want to? He looked at Ilara again, her slender shoulders hunched as if against an expected blow. There was a dignity in her stillness, a quiet endurance that pricked at his conscience. Whatever her past, she was here now, and she was his responsibility. Or at least, he had made her so. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was a stark testament to Silas's solitary life. A small, sturdy cabin of hewn logs stood weathered and grey, a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. He'd left a fire banked. A modest barn, a corral, and a few struggling outbuildings were clustered nearby, all dwarfed by the immense, rolling landscape that stretched to the horizon in every direction. There were no friendly neighboring homesteads in sight, only the vast, indifferent sky and the whisper of the wind through the tall grass. This was isolation, raw and unfiltered. "We're here," Silas announced, his voice breaking the long silence. He pulled Bess to a halt and climbed down, his movements stiff from the long ride. He reached up to help Ilara, his hand surprisingly gentle as it closed around her arm. She flinched slightly at the contact, but allowed him to assist her to the ground. Her legs felt unsteady. "It's quiet," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Silas grunted. "It is that." He gestured towards the cabin. "Go on inside. I'll unhitch Bess and bring your bag." The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a single cot was tucked into a corner. A curtained-off alcove lightly hid another sleeping space. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and loneliness. Ilara walked slowly to the small, greased paper window, looking out at the seemingly endless land. She felt a wave of desolation wash over her. What had she done? What had he done? Silas entered, placing her bag by the door. "There's stew on the stove. Help yourself. The other room is through there." He gestured to the curtain. It was Martha's. "My wife's." He said it simply, without inflection, but the words hung in the air. "You can take it." He didn't wait for a reply. Turning and heading back outside, Ilara stood frozen, the information settling upon her. He was a widower. This cabin held memories of another woman, a life shared. And now she was here, an interloper, carrying another's shame. Later, after a mostly silent meal of stew and hardtack, the awkwardness was a palpable thing between them. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty was lost on Ilara. She was too consumed by uncertainty. Silas finally broke the silence, his voice low. "The preacher, Parson Davies, comes through once a month. Next visits in 2 weeks." He paused, then met her gaze directly. "We should be married then, for the child's sake. Give him a name." Ilara stared at him, her heart pounding. Marriage? To this stranger? It was what mail-order arrangements often led to, but given her condition, she hadn't dared assume. "Mr. Blackwood." "Silas," he corrected gruffly. "And it's the practical thing, Miss Ilara. Folks will talk less. The boy will have a name. That's all." He made it sound like a business transaction, devoid of any sentiment. Perhaps it was. She thought of the alternative, being cast out, alone, with a baby to care for. The looming poverty, the shame, the sheer impossibility of it all. This man, this gruff, solitary rancher, was offering a lifeline, however strange and unexpected its form. "All right, Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, "if that's what you think is best." He merely nodded, his gaze already distant, looking out the window into the encroaching darkness. "Best get some rest. Sun's up early here." That night, in the small room that had belonged to Martha, Elara lay on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the sigh of the wind around the eaves of the cabin. It was a lonely sound, but tonight, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel quite so threatening. She wasn't entirely alone. She touched her belly, where the life within her stirred. He needs a father. Perhaps in this desolate place with this stoic man, they might both find one. The thought was fragile, tentative, but it was a seed of hope, planted in barren ground. The days that followed settled into a quiet, cautious rhythm. Silas was a man of few words, his life dictated by the relentless demands of the ranch. He rose before dawn, tended to his small herd of cattle, mended fences, chopped wood, and worked the stubborn patch of land he hoped would yield a meager vegetable garden. Elara, despite her advancing pregnancy, tried to make herself useful. She swept the cabin, learned to cook on the temperamental wood stove Silas used, mended his worn clothing, and fetched water from the well. Her movements were slow, sometimes clumsy, and she often felt Silas's eyes on her, though his expression remained unreadable. He never complained about her limitations, nor did he offer undue assistance, seemingly content to let her find her own way. The cabin was small, and their proximity was unavoidable, yet a vast emotional distance remained between them. They spoke mostly of practical matters, the weather, the dwindling supplies, the tasks that needed doing. He never asked about her past, and she never offered. The unspoken hung heavy in the air, a constant awareness of her condition and the questions it raised. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking fence lines, Elara decided to tackle the small vegetable patch near the cabin. It was overgrown with weeds, the soil dry and impacted. She found a rusty hoe in the lean-to and began to work, the sun beating down on her back. It was harder than she anticipated. Her belly was cumbersome, her back ached, and dizziness threatened with every swing of the hoe. After an hour, she was forced to sit on a rock, breathless and sweating, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. This was his life, this constant toil, and she felt like a burden, unable to contribute meaningfully. She didn't hear Silas approach. He'd returned early, a worry about a stray calf cutting his patrol short. He stood for a moment, watching her slumped figure, the hoe lying abandoned beside her. He saw the sheen of sweat on her brow, the way her hand instinctively went to her rounded stomach. He said nothing about her struggle, merely walked to the well, drew a bucket of cool water, and brought a dipperful to her. "Too hot for that kind of work," he said, his voice neutral as she drank gratefully. "Leave it. I'll see to it later." Elara looked up at him, shamefaced. "I wanted to help." "You help enough," he said, his gaze sweeping over the tidier cabin, the mended shirt he wore. It was as close to a compliment as he ever came. He then picked up the hoe and, with practiced ease, began to clear a section of the patch, his movements economical and efficient. Elara watched him, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the sun. He hadn't berated her, hadn't made her feel inadequate. He had simply understood. It was a small moment, but it felt significant, a tiny crack in the wall of his reserve. Their first trip into Harmony Creek together, for supplies, was an ordeal Elara had dreaded. As Silas guided the wagon down the dusty main street, she felt the stares like physical blows. Whispers followed them like flies. She saw Mrs. Henderson, the station master's wife, purse her lips in disapproval from the porch of the general store, her eyes raking over Elara's obvious condition. Two cowhands lounging outside the saloon stopped their talk to stare, nudging each other and grinning. Elara kept her head down, her cheeks burning, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. Silas, however, seemed oblivious, or perhaps defiant. He strode into the general store with Elara a step behind him, his demeanor calm, his requests for flour, salt, and coffee beans delivered in his usual terse manner. Mr. Grissom, the storekeeper, a man whose curiosity was as wide as his girth, tried to engage Silas in conversation, his eyes darting towards Elara. "Heard you had an arrival, Blackwood," Grissom said, a sly tone in his voice. Didn't expect quite so soon, if you take my meaning." Silas's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, narrowed slightly. "I expect the goods I pay for, Grissom, and a bit of civility. Anything else is my business." His voice was quiet, but it carried an unmistakable edge of steel. Grissom's smirk faltered, and he busied himself weighing out the flour with unaccustomed diligence. Outside, as they loaded their purchases, Henderson himself sauntered over, a knowing look on his face. "Blackwood, ma'am." He tipped his hat to Elara with exaggerated politeness. "Settling in all right, are you? Quite the surprise you brought with you." Before Elara could shrink further, Silas stepped slightly in front of her. "She's settling in fine, Henderson, and she's my wife now, or will be, come Parson Davy's next visit. Any issue with that?" Henderson, faced with Silas's direct, unyielding stare, seemed to deflate. "No, no issue, Blackwood. Just making polite conversation." He backed away, muttering something under his breath. As they drove away from Harmony Creek, Elara finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she whispered, looking at Silas. He just grunted. Folks got tongues. Best to give 'em little to wag about, or something clear to chew on. But she saw the muscle still working in his jaw. He had defended her, publicly claimed her. It was more than she had ever expected. The journey back to the ranch felt different, lighter. The silence between them was still there, but it was less heavy, laced now with a thread of something akin to alliance. She was beginning to see that beneath Silas Blackwood's gruff exterior lay a core of unexpected decency, perhaps even kindness. The prairie wind still whispered its lonely song, but Elara found herself listening for a different rhythm, the steady beat of a man's quiet strength beside her. And for the first time, the vast, empty land didn't feel quite so desolate. It felt like a refuge, a place where, perhaps, a new, unconventional family could take root. The seed of hope, planted that first night, sent out a fragile, tentative shoot. The weeks leading up to Parson Davies' arrival were filled with a quiet industry. Silas, true to his word, prepared the small plot for a garden, turning the soil with a determination that seemed to challenge the very stubbornness of the land. Elara, feeling a bit stronger as her initial exhaustion waned, took to tending the chickens Silas kept, collecting eggs, and experimenting with meager ingredients to create palatable meals. She found a small, dog-eared book of Martha's recipes tucked away in a drawer, simple, hearty fare, and tried her best to replicate them. Sometimes in the evenings, after the chores were done and the prairie night descended, Silas would sit by the fire, mending tack or sharpening a tool, while Elara sewed, her needle flashing in the lamplight. The silence between them was still a prominent feature of their shared existence, but it was changing. It was less the silence of strangers and more the comfortable quiet of two people becoming accustomed to each other's presence. Elara learned to read the subtle shifts in Silas's moods, the slight tightening of his lips when he was worried about the weather affecting his cattle, the almost imperceptible softening around his eyes when Bess nuzzled his hand. He, in turn, seemed to notice things about her too. He started leaving a small stool near the hearth for her in the evenings, without comment, knowing her back often troubled her. Once, when she pricked her finger badly while sewing, he wordlessly took the needle and fabric from her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he finished the seam. She watched him, her heart doing a strange little flutter. These small, unspoken kindnesses were weaving a delicate web between them, a connection built not on words, but on shared space and quiet observation. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the sky turning a bruised purple, Silas was securing the shutters on the cabin. Elara stood in the doorway, watching the wind whip the tall grasses into a frenzy. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her lower back, making her gasp and clutch her belly. Silas was at her side in an instant, his face etched with concern. "What is it? The baby?" "Just a pain," she managed, though fear clutched at her. It passed. But his gaze remained troubled. "You sit down. No more standing." He guided her to Martha's old rocking chair, a piece he rarely acknowledged. "I'll fetch some water." Later, as the storm raged outside, rattling the small cabin, they sat in the dim light of a single lamp. The baby was restless, kicking and turning within her. Elara absently stroked her stomach, a small, unconscious smile playing on her lips. Silas watched her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "He's active tonight," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Silas cleared his throat. "Does it hurt much, the carrion?" The question surprised her. It was the first time he'd directly acknowledged the physical reality of her pregnancy beyond his initial pronouncement at the station. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Mostly, it's just heavy and a bit frightening, wondering if I'm doing everything right." He nodded slowly. "Martha, she wanted children. We tried. It never happened." The admission was quiet, raw, a glimpse into a past sorrow he rarely, if ever, spoke of. A wave of empathy washed over Elara. She saw the loneliness in him then, not just the solitude of a man living alone, but the deeper ache of unfulfilled dreams. "I'm sorry, Silas." He shrugged, looking away into the fire. Was a long time ago, but the shadows in his eyes told a different story. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and cool. The shared vulnerability of that moment, however brief, shifted something between them. Elara began to understand that his gruffness wasn't unkindness, but a shield built around old wounds. And perhaps, just perhaps, her presence and the impending arrival of the child wasn't just a burden he'd taken on, but something that stirred a long-dormant part of him. The day Parson Davies was due, Elara felt a nervous flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with the baby. She wore her best dress, a faded blue calico she had painstakingly mended and pressed. Silas had shaved carefully and put on a clean, though worn, shirt. He looked different, less the solitary rancher, more a man preparing for a solemn occasion. The parson arrived mid-morning, a cheerful, round man on a sturdy pony, his Bible tucked into his saddlebag. He greeted Silas warmly and then turned to Elara, his gaze kind and without judgment, though she knew he must have heard the gossip in Harmony Creek. "Miss Elara," he said, his voice gentle, "Silas has told me of your intentions, a joyous, if somewhat swift, occasion." The ceremony was brief, conducted in the front room of the cabin with the prairie wind sighing outside the open door as their only witness. Elara stood beside Silas, her hand trembling slightly as she repeated her vows. His hand, when it took hers to place a simple, unadorned gold band on her finger, Martha's ring, she realized with a pang, was warm and steady. When the parson pronounced them man and wife, a profound silence fell. It was done. She was Elara Blackwood. The child she carried would have a name, a legitimate place in the world, however unconventional its beginnings. Silas's expression was unreadable. As he looked down at her, he simply nodded at the parson. "Thank you, parson. We appreciate you making the journey." After sharing a midday meal, Elara had baked a slightly lopsided apple pie from their dwindling supply of dried apples. The parson departed, promising to return in a month to check on them, and, he added with a twinkle in his eye, perhaps to discuss a baptism. When he was gone, an awkwardness descended upon Silas and Elara. They were married, legally bound. Yet, little had changed in the practicalities of their lives, save for the ring on her finger and the new name she bore. That evening, as Elara prepared to retire to her small room, Silas spoke, his back to her as he stared out the window. "The other room, my room, it's small, but there's space enough. If you'd prefer." The offer hung in the air. It wasn't a demand, nor was it laden with expectation. It was an invitation, perhaps, to bridge the physical distance that still separated them, to make their marriage more than just a piece of paper. Elara's heart beat faster. She thought of the lonely nights, the vastness of the prairie pressing in. She thought of the small kindnesses, the shared silences that were becoming less strained. She thought of the child, who would soon need more than just a name. He would need a family, however patched together. "All right, Silas," she said softly. "Thank you." He didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders relax almost imperceptibly. That night, she moved her few belongings into his room. The bed was narrow, and they lay stiffly, careful not to touch, the silence filled with unspoken thoughts and the awareness of each other's proximity. But as sleep finally claimed her, Elara felt a sense of security she hadn't known before. She was no longer just the pregnant mail-order bride. She was Mrs. Blackwood. And in the quiet breathing of the man beside her, she sensed not a master but a partner, however reluctant and unconventional their union. The roots of their shared life were slowly, tentatively, taking hold in the hard prairie soil. The rhythm of their days continued, but a subtle shift had occurred. Sharing a room, a bed, even in the chaste and careful way they did, bred a new kind of intimacy. Ilara became attuned to the sound of Silas's breathing in the dark, the way he muttered in his sleep sometimes, the quiet groan he made when he first rose in the pre-dawn chill. He, in turn, became more aware of her movements, her increasing discomfort as the baby grew, the soft sighs she'd release when a particularly strong kick surprised her. He started taking on more of the physically demanding chores without comment, ensuring the wood box was always full, that the water buckets were never too heavy for her to manage. He even fashioned a more comfortable chair for her from willow branches and an old sheepskin, placing it by the window where she liked to sit and sew. He presented it gruffly, thought this might be better for your back, and then quickly retreated outside, embarrassed by his own display of thoughtfulness. Ilara's heart swelled. These gestures, small and unspoken, meant more to her than any grand pronouncements. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ilara was mending one of Silas's shirts. The baby was particularly active, and she paused, her hand resting on her swollen abdomen, a soft smile on her face. Silas watched her, his usual stoicism momentarily softened by the firelight. "He moves a lot," he observed, his voice low. "He does," Ilara affirmed. "Sometimes I think he's practicing his kicking for when he's big enough to chase cattle." A faint smile touched Silas's lips, a rare occurrence. Might be at that. He hesitated, then asked, "Have you thought of a name?" Ilara looked up, surprised. They hadn't spoken of such things. I had a brother, Thomas. He died when I was small. I always liked the name." Silas nodded slowly. "Thomas Blackwood. It's a good, strong name." He looked into the fire, a distant expression on his face. Martha liked the name Samuel. A pang of something, guilt, sadness, went through Ilara. She was living in Martha's house, wearing Martha's ring, and now, potentially, displacing Martha's preferred name for a child. "Samuel is a fine name too, Silas." He shook his head. "No, Thomas. It was your thought first. Thomas Blackwood it is." He said it with a finality that brooked no argument. And in that moment, Ilara felt another invisible thread bind them together. He was not just accepting the child, he was actively participating in its future, in its identity. Their tentative peace, however, was not to last undisturbed. Their next trip to Harmony Creek brought with it a sharper reminder of the outside world's judgment. As Silas negotiated for winter supplies, the days were growing shorter, the mornings crisper. Ilara waited in the wagon. Mrs. Henderson, accompanied by another townswoman, Mrs. Gable, a known gossip with a face like a prune, approached the wagon, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. "Well, well, Mrs. Blackwood, isn't it?" Mrs. Henderson said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Getting quite sizable, aren't we? The parson certainly wasted no time with you two." Mrs. Gable tittered. "Some folks have all the luck, or perhaps not luck at all if you catch my drift." Her eyes flicked meaningfully to Ilara's belly. Ilara felt the blood rush to her cheeks. She wanted to shrink away, to disappear. But then she thought of Silas, of his quiet defense of her, of the name they had chosen together for her son. A spark of defiance, something she hadn't known she possessed, ignited within her. She looked directly at Mrs. Henderson. "My husband and I are very happy, thank you. And yes, the baby is growing well. We're very much looking forward to his arrival." She placed a protective hand on her stomach. Mrs. Henderson looked taken aback by Ilara's calm, direct response. Before she could rally, Silas returned, his face darkening as he took in the scene. "Ladies," he said, his voice dangerously low, "my wife and I have business to attend to." He helped Ilara down from the wagon, his hand firmly on her arm, a clear signal of possession and protection. He guided her into the store, leaving the two women sputtering on the street. Inside, Grissom, who had clearly witnessed the exchange, was unusually subdued. As Silas paid for their goods, he cleared his throat. "Blackwood," he began, then seemed to think better of it. "Weather's turnin'. Best be prepared for a hard winter." "Always am, Grissom," Silas replied curtly. On the ride back to the ranch, Silas was silent for a long time. Ilara worried that he was angry, that her small act of defiance had embarrassed him. Finally, he spoke, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You handled yourself well back there, Ilara." She looked at him in surprise. "You're not angry?" "Angry? At them, maybe. Not at you. He shifted on the seat. They got no right to judge. No right at all. A wave of warmth and gratitude washed over her. He wasn't just offering her protection anymore. He was offering her his respect. And in that moment, Elara knew that her feelings for this gruff, solitary man were deepening into something far more profound than gratitude or dependence. It felt dangerously close to affection, perhaps even love. The prairie seemed less vast, the cabin less isolated. It was becoming home, a sanctuary built by two lonely souls and the promise of a new life. The roots were digging deeper, holding firm against the harsh winds of judgment. As autumn painted the prairie in hues of gold and russet, Elara's time drew near. Her movements became slower, more deliberate. The baby, Thomas as they now both called him in their quiet conversations, was a constant, active presence within her. Silas watched her with a quiet concern that was almost tender. He took over all the heavy chores, often chiding her gently if he found her attempting anything strenuous. Rest, Elara. The boy needs you strong. He began to spend more evenings inside, close to the fire, ostensibly mending harness or reading an old almanac. But Elara knew he was keeping vigil, his senses attuned to any sign from her. He spoke more freely now, sometimes telling her stories of his early days on the ranch, of the struggles to carve a life from the unforgiving land. He even spoke a little more of Martha, not with fresh grief, but with a quiet reminiscence that Elara found comforting rather than threatening. She was not replacing Martha. She was simply part of a new chapter in his life, a chapter that included her and Thomas. One crisp October morning, Elara woke with a dull ache in her lower back that was different from the usual discomforts of pregnancy. It came and went, a rhythmic tightening that grew steadily stronger. She lay still for a long time, breathing through the sensations, a mixture of fear and anticipation churning within her. When Silas stirred beside her, she reached out and touched his arm. "Silas," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I think it's time." He was instantly awake, his eyes clearing as he sat up. He looked at her, his face serious. "Are you sure?" She nodded, another contraction gripping her. He swung his legs out of bed, his movements quick and efficient. "All right, you stay put. I'll get the water heated." And everything else. He seemed to be talking more to himself, trying to recall the scant knowledge he possessed about childbirth, gleaned mostly from hushed conversations between women years ago. The day was a blur of pain, fear, and an astonishing primal effort. Silas was a constant presence, his initial awkwardness giving way to a quiet, steadfast support. He wiped her brow with cool cloths, held her hand when the pains were at their worst, murmured words of encouragement that she barely registered but somehow drew strength from. He never left her side, his face a mask of concern, his usual gruffness completely stripped away, revealing the worried, caring man beneath. Hours later, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor, a new sound filled the small room, the thin, wailing cry of a newborn baby. Silas, his hands surprisingly gentle, cleaned the infant and wrapped him in a soft linen cloth Elara had prepared. He looked down at the tiny, red-faced baby, his expression a mixture of awe and something akin to wonder. Then, he carefully placed the child in Elara's waiting arms. "A boy, Elara," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A healthy boy." Elara looked down at her son, her Thomas. Tears streamed down her face, tears of exhaustion, relief, and an overwhelming, fierce love. He was so small, so perfect. She touched his tiny, clenched fist, his soft cheek. Silas stood watching them, a strange, unreadable emotion in his eyes. He had seen life and death on the prairie, had faced hardship and loss, but nothing had prepared him for this moment, for the raw, powerful miracle of birth, for the fierce protective wave that washed over him as he looked at this child, not his by blood, but his by choice, by declaration. "Thomas Blackwood," Elara whispered, her voice choked. She looked up at Silas, her eyes shining. "Our son." Silas reached out a hesitant finger and gently touched the baby's head. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Our son," he echoed, his voice raspy. In that moment, with the cries of a newborn filling the cabin, the last vestiges of their initial arrangement, the pragmatic agreement between a desperate woman and a lonely man, dissolved. They were no longer just a mail-order bride and the rancher who had taken her in. They were a family, forged in shared hardship, quiet understanding, and now the profound, binding miracle of a new life. The prairie wind still whistled outside, but inside the small cabin there was only warmth and the dawning of a love that had taken root in the most unlikely of soils. The arrival of Thomas transformed the small cabin and the lives within it. The silence Silas had once cherished, then endured, was now filled with the gurgles, cries, and soft snuffling sounds of a baby. Elara, though tired, blossomed with a quiet joy. She spent hours simply gazing at Thomas, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes, the way he pursed his lips in sleep. Silas, initially awkward around the infant, found himself inexplicably drawn to him. He would stand by the cradle he had fashioned from a sturdy wooden box, watching Thomas sleep, a look of profound tenderness softening his rugged features. He learned to hold him, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle, and sometimes Elara would hear him humming a tuneless lullaby when he thought she wasn't listening. Their partnership deepened, forged in the shared responsibility of caring for Thomas. They worked together seamlessly, a silent understanding passing between them. Elara would nurse and care for the baby, while Silas ensured the fire was always lit, the cabin warm, and their meager supplies stretched as far as possible. He became fiercely protective of them both. When a traveling peddler, known for his prying questions and loose tongue, stopped by the ranch, Silas met him at the door, his demeanor so forbidding that the peddler quickly stated his business and departed without even a glimpse of Elara or the child. One evening, as Elara rocked Thomas by the fire, Silas sat across from her, cleaning his rifle. The baby was fretful, and Elara hummed softly, trying to soothe him. "He looks like you, around the eyes," Silas said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Elara looked up, surprised. It was something she had noticed herself, a faint resemblance to her own late father in the shape of Thomas's eyes. "Do you think so?" Silas nodded. "Aye, and he's got your stubborn chin, I reckon." A rare smile touched his lips. Elara laughed softly. "And your quiet nature, perhaps. He only cries when he truly needs something." Their gazes met over the sleeping child, a shared warmth passing between them. The unspoken questions about Thomas's biological father, the shadows of Elara's past, seemed to have receded, replaced by the undeniable reality of their present. This child, their Thomas, was binding them together in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The news of the baby's birth eventually reached Harmony Creek, carried by the parson on his next visit for the baptism. The ceremony was simple, held in the cabin, with Parson Davies officiating and Silas and Elara standing as proud, if unconventional, parents. Elara had worried about the town's reaction, but Silas seemed unconcerned. "He's our son. He's a Blackwood. That's all that matters." And surprisingly, the tide of gossip seemed to have turned, or at least quieted. Perhaps it was the parson's benign acceptance, or Silas's unwavering stance, or simply the undeniable fact of a new life. When they next ventured into town for essential supplies, the stares were less hostile, tinged more with curiosity than scorn. Mrs. Grissom, the storekeeper's wife, a woman Elara had always found intimidating, even offered her a small hand-knitted baby blanket. "For the little one," she said, her voice surprisingly kind. "Every child deserves a warm welcome." Elara was touched by the unexpected gesture. Perhaps, she thought, people were capable of seeing beyond prejudice, of accepting a family formed in unconventional circumstances. As winter truly set in, blanketing the prairie in a thick layer of snow, the small family drew closer, cocooned in the warmth of their cabin. The days were short, the nights long, but the isolation no longer felt oppressive. It was a shared solitude, filled with the small routines of caring for Thomas, the quiet companionship, and the growing affection between Silas and Elara. One particularly cold night, as a blizzard raged outside, shaking the very foundations of the cabin, Thomas began to cry, a thin, distressed wail. Elara tried to soothe him, but he remained fretful. Silas, who had been reading by the fire, came over to them. "Let me try," he said softly, taking the baby from her. He held Thomas against his broad chest, walking slowly around the small room, his deep voice rumbling a low, soothing song that was more a vibration than a melody. Gradually, Thomas's cries subsided, and he snuggled into Silas's embrace, his tiny body relaxing. Ilara watched them, her heart overflowing. The image of this rugged, solitary rancher, so tenderly comforting her child, a child not of his blood but clearly of his heart, was almost more than she could bear. The love she felt for Silas in that moment was fierce and undeniable, a deep, steady flame that had been slowly kindled in the ashes of her past despair. When Thomas was finally asleep, Silas carefully laid him in his cradle. He turned to Ilara, his eyes meeting hers in the dim firelight. The air between them was charged with unspoken emotions. "Ilara," he began, his voice rough, us, it's more than I ever bargained for, more than I ever thought I'd have again." She moved closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "For me too, Silas. You gave me a home, a name for my son. You gave us a life." He covered her hand with his own, his grip strong and warm. "You brought life back to this place, Ilara. To me." He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her, his gaze intense. "This ain't just about the boy needing a father anymore, is it?" "No, Silas," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It's not." He leaned down then, and his lips met hers, hesitant at first, then with a deepening tenderness that spoke of shared hardship, unspoken understanding, and a love that had defied all expectations. It was a kiss that sealed their unconventional union, a promise of a future built not on convenience or duty, but on a profound and abiding connection. Outside, the blizzard raged, but inside the small cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the quiet breathing of their son, Silas and Ilara had found their shelter, their peace, their love. The lonely rancher had not just given a child a father, he had found a wife, a son, and a family. And Ilara, the rejected mail-order bride, had found not just a refuge, but a love story written in the heart of the unforgiving prairie. The deep snows of winter eventually gave way to the tender green shoots of spring. The prairie, once stark and frozen, slowly awakened, mirroring the blossoming of life within the Blackwood cabin. Thomas was thriving, a happy, gurgling baby who was beginning to show a distinct personality, a blend of Ilara's quiet resilience and, she often teased Silas, his own stubborn determination. He would fix his gaze on something he wanted, a rattle or Silas's finger, with an unblinking intensity that made them both laugh. Silas had changed. The deep lines of loneliness around his eyes had softened, replaced by a warmth that Ilara found herself basking in. He smiled more easily now, a genuine, crinkling smile that reached his eyes, especially when he was playing with Thomas, letting the baby tug on his beard or clutch his fingers in a surprisingly strong grip. He still worked his land with the same relentless diligence, but there was a new purpose to his labor. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was building, providing for his family. Ilara, too, had found her footing. The shadows of her past, the shame and fear that had haunted her, had largely receded. She was Mrs. Blackwood, mother to Thomas, wife to Silas. She managed their small home with a quiet efficiency, her days filled with the comforting rhythms of domesticity, punctuated by the joys and challenges of caring for a growing baby. She even started a small herb garden near the cabin door, coaxing fragrant sprigs of thyme and rosemary from the prairie soil. Their relationship, born of necessity and circumstance, had deepened into a true partnership. They talked more now, sharing their thoughts and worries, their small joys and hopes for the future. The physical intimacy that had begun so hesitantly had blossomed into a tender affection, a comfortable closeness that spoke volumes in the quiet moments they shared after Thomas was asleep. Sometimes, Silas would simply reach for her hand as they sat by the fire, his touch a silent reassurance of his love and commitment. One bright spring morning, Silas was out mending a section of fence that bordered the creek, Thomas strapped securely to his back in a sling Ilara had fashioned. The baby gurgled happily, batting at a stray strand of Silas's hair. Ilara watched them from the cabin doorway, a soft smile on her face. This was her life now, a life she could never have imagined, a life filled with unexpected love and quiet contentment. Suddenly, she saw two riders approaching in the distance, heading not towards the main track to the ranch, but directly towards Silas at the fence line. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Strangers were not uncommon, but there was something about their purposeful approach that set her on edge. She recognized one of them as Henderson, the station master, his face set in a grim expression. The other man was taller, dressed in city clothes that looked out of place on the prairie, his face unfamiliar and stern. Ilara's heart began to pound. She quickly stepped back inside, her mind racing. Who was this stranger, and why was Henderson with him, looking so serious? A sense of foreboding washed over her, a cold dread that chilled her despite the warm spring air. She hurried to the window, peering out, her gaze fixed on the figures now dismounting near Silas. She saw Silas turn, his body tensing as he recognized Henderson, and assessed the stranger. Even from this distance, she could see the shift in his posture, the way he moved to subtly position himself between the riders and Thomas on his back. The men began to talk, their voices too low for her to hear, but their gestures were animated, tense. The stranger seemed to be doing most of the talking, his tone insistent, almost demanding. Henderson looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Silas stood his ground, his responses seemingly brief and curt. Ilara felt a tremor of fear. This had to be about her, about Thomas. Who else could this stranger be, arriving unannounced with the town's foremost gossip in tow? Her past, which she had thought safely buried, was suddenly rearing its ugly head. She clutched her hands together, praying that whatever this was, Silas could handle it, could protect them. But a sickening certainty grew within her. This was a threat, a direct challenge to the fragile peace they had built. The idyllic spring morning had suddenly turned ominous, and the future she had just begun to embrace felt terrifyingly precarious. The confrontation by the creek was not just a discussion, it felt like the opening salvo of a battle for her son and for the life she had come to cherish. Silas listened, his face impassive, as the stranger, a man named Alistair Finch, spoke. Finch was a lawyer, he explained, representing the estate of a Mr. Arthur Penwright of Boston. And Arthur Penwright, Finch declared with an air of smug certainty, was the deceased biological father of Ilara's child. He produced papers, legal documents filled with jargon that Silas barely understood, but whose intent was chillingly clear. Penwright's family, wealthy and influential, had learned of the child's existence and, having no other direct heirs, now sought to claim him. They considered Ilara an unsuitable guardian, a woman of questionable morals who had, in their eyes, entrapped their scion. They were prepared to offer a generous sum for her cooperation. Henderson, looking increasingly wretched, chimed in, "Silas, Mr. Finch here just wants what's legal. Penwright was a rich man. The boy would have opportunities." Silas's eyes, cold as ice chips, flicked to Henderson. Opportunities, or a life among strangers who think his mother is dirt beneath their feet? He turned back to Finch, his voice dangerously low. "That boy on my back is Thomas Blackwood, my son. His mother is my wife. This is his home." Finch scoffed. "A marriage of convenience, Mr. Blackwood, hastily arranged to legitimize a bastard. We know the circumstances. We can prove paternity. The courts will favor the blood relatives, especially those with means and standing." He gestured vaguely towards the modest ranch. "What can you offer him here? A life of toil and obscurity." A red mist of fury clouded Silas's vision. He thought of Ilara, her quiet strength, her gentle love for Thomas. He thought of the baby, his son, gurgling happily on his back, oblivious to the men who sought to tear their lives apart. "I offer him a father who loves him," Silas said, his voice grating. "A mother who would die for him. A home where he is cherished, not seen as a commodity or a means to an inheritance." He took a step closer to Finch, his hands clenched into fists. "You can take your papers and your money and ride off my land. Thomas stays here." Finch's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over, Blackwood. We will pursue this through legal channels. You can't fight the Penwright family. They always get what they want." "We'll see about that," Silas growled. "Now get off my property before I forget I'm a civilized man." Finch, though clearly angered, seemed to recognize the unyielding resolve in Silas's stance, and perhaps the physical threat. He exchanged a look with Henderson, then remounted. "You'll be hearing from us, Blackwood, through the law." Henderson, avoiding Silas's gaze, mumbled, "Just doing my job, Silas," and hurried after Finch. Silas watched them ride away, his heart pounding, a cold dread settling in his gut. He reached back, his hand resting protectively on Thomas. This was far from over. This was a fight for his son, for his family, against forces far more powerful and insidious than any prairie storm or harsh winter. He turned and strode back towards the cabin, his mind already racing, trying to formulate a plan, a defense. Ilara met him at the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Silas, what was that? Who were they?" He stepped inside, unstrapping Thomas and handing him to her. "Trouble, Ilara," he said grimly. "Big trouble. They want to take Thomas." The words hung in the air, heavy and devastating. Ilara clutched Thomas to her breast, her eyes filling with terror. "No," she whispered. "No, they can't." Silas put his hands on her shoulders, his gaze steady and resolute. "They won't. I won't let them. He's our son, and we'll fight for him, Ilara, together." His words, though spoken in the face of a daunting threat, were a lifeline. She looked into his eyes, saw the fierce determination there, the unwavering love for her and for Thomas. And in that moment, her fear began to recede, replaced by a matching resolve. They had built this life together, against all odds. They would not let it be torn apart. The battle lines were drawn. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Silas and Ilara discussed their options late into the night, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls, mirroring the uncertainty that loomed over them. Silas knew Finch was right about one thing. The Penwrights had money and influence, things he sorely lacked. Harmony Creek had no lawyer, and the nearest town with legal counsel was a 2-day ride, a journey he couldn't afford in terms of time or money, especially with the ranch needing constant attention and Thomas so young. Ilara, haunted by the thought of losing her son, became quieter, her eyes often shadowed with worry. But beneath the fear, a steely determination was hardening. She had been a victim of circumstance for too long. This time she would fight. She recalled every detail of her brief, disastrous acquaintance with Arthur Penwright, a charming, feckless young man from a wealthy family, who had pursued her relentlessly during her time as a seamstress in a boarding house, made promises he never intended to keep, and then vanished when he learned of her pregnancy, leaving her destitute and disgraced. She had never sought anything from him or his family, wanting only to escape the shame and build a new life. Now, his past was reaching out to claim the most precious thing in her world. Silas, seeing her distress, tried to reassure her. "We'll find a way, Ilara. We have to." He wrote a letter to Parson Davies, explaining their predicament, hoping the clergyman might know someone or have some advice. He also considered selling a few head of cattle, a painful sacrifice, to raise funds for a lawyer, should it come to that. The threat hung over them like a storm cloud. Every distant rider, every unfamiliar sound sent a jolt of anxiety through Ilara. She rarely let Thomas out of her sight, her maternal instincts fiercely protective. One afternoon, a week after Finch's visit, another rider approached the ranch. It wasn't Finch, nor was it Henderson. It was a lone woman, riding side saddle on a fine mare, her attire elegant but practical. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. Was this one of the Penwrights? Silas met her at the door, his stance wary. The woman dismounted gracefully. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, her face lined but intelligent, her eyes surprisingly kind. "Mr. Blackwood," she inquired, her voice cultured. "I am Eleanor Penwright. Arthur was my nephew." Silas tensed. "If you've come for the boy, ma'am, you're wasting your time." Eleanor Penwright held up a hand. "Please, Mr. Blackwood, may I speak with you, and with your wife? I haven't come to make demands. I've come to understand." Silas hesitated, then glanced back at Ilara, who had appeared in the doorway, Thomas in her arms. He saw the fear in Ilara's eyes, but also a flicker of something else, a desperate hope perhaps. He nodded curtly. "All right, come inside." Inside the cabin, Eleanor Penwright looked around, her gaze taking in the humble surroundings, the signs of a hard-working life, the undeniable evidence of a loving home. Her eyes softened when she saw Thomas, who gurgled and reached out a tiny hand towards her. "He is a beautiful child," she said softly, her voice devoid of the arrogance Finch had displayed. She turned to Ilara. "My dear, I am so sorry for the distress my family has caused you. Arthur, he was often reckless and caused a great deal of pain. I had no idea about any of this until Alistair Finch returned from his expedition. She grimaced slightly at the word. My sister-in-law, Arthur's mother, is determined, Eleanor continued. She sees Thomas as the last link to her son, a way to continue the family name. She doesn't understand, or perhaps doesn't want to understand, that a child needs more than a name and money. He needs love. He needs his mother. Ilara listened, her heart pounding. Could this woman be an ally? I've seen Finch's report, Eleanor said, her gaze meeting Silas's. He describes a rough rancher and a desperate woman. He doesn't describe what I see here. She looked from Silas to Ilara, then to Thomas. I see a family, a loving family. She paused, then said, I cannot control my sister-in-law completely, but I have some influence. And I believe a child belongs with his mother, especially when she has a husband who clearly loves and supports them both. She opened her reticule and took out a document. This is a legal affidavit, Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood. It states that I have met you, I have seen Thomas, and I believe he is in a safe, loving, and stable home. It also states my intention to argue against any custody claim from my side of the family, and to use my own resources to support your right to keep your son. Silas and Ilara stared at her, stunned. This was an unexpected reprieve, a ray of hope in their darkest hour. Why? Silas asked, his voice hoarse. Why would you do this for us? Eleanor Penwright smiled, a sad, gentle smile. Because I have seen too many lives ruined by pride and greed, Mr. Blackwood, and because I once loved a man my family disapproved of. I know what it is to fight for happiness. She looked at Thomas again. He deserves to grow up knowing he is loved for who he is, not for what he represents. And you, my dear, she said to Ilara, deserve peace. Tears streamed down Ilara's face. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Eleanor Penwright stayed only a short while longer, asking gentle questions about Thomas, about their life on the ranch. When she departed, she left behind not just the affidavit, but a profound sense of relief and gratitude. The threat hadn't vanished entirely, but it had been significantly diminished. They had a powerful ally, someone from within the Penwright family itself, who believed in them. That night, after Thomas was asleep, Silas pulled Ilara into his arms, holding her close. She was an answered prayer, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was, Ilara agreed, leaning her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Oh, Silas, I was so scared. I know, me too. He kissed the top of her head. But we faced it, together, and we'll face whatever else comes, always. The fear had not entirely dissipated, but it was now overlaid with a resilient hope. They had stood their ground, declared their love and their right to be a family, and in the most unexpected way, help had come. The bond between them, forged in hardship and sealed by their love for Thomas, was stronger than ever. They had faced the storm, and though the skies were not yet entirely clear, they knew they could weather whatever came next, as long as they stood together. Their simple life on the prairie, once so fragile, now felt rooted, resilient, and fiercely protected. The affidavit from Eleanor Penwright proved to be the decisive factor. Alistair Finch, upon learning of her intervention and her willingness to contest any legal action, advised Arthur Penwright's mother that their chances of gaining custody were now slim and would involve a protracted and ugly public battle she was unlikely to win, especially against her own sister-in-law's testimony. Reluctantly, and with much bitterness, Mrs. Penwright abandoned her pursuit. A letter arrived some weeks later, not from Finch, but from Eleanor Penwright herself, informing them that the matter was closed. Thomas was theirs, legally and unequivocally. The relief that washed over Silas and Ilara was immense, like a physical weight being lifted from their shoulders. They stood in the doorway of their cabin, the letter in Silas's hand, and looked out at the vast prairie, which suddenly seemed brighter, more welcoming. Ilara leaned against Silas, Thomas held securely in her arms, and for the first time in months, she felt a profound sense of peace. "It's over, Silas," she whispered, tears of joy welling in her eyes. "It's truly over." He put his arm around her, pulling her and Thomas closer. "Aye," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "He's ours. No one can take him now." They celebrated that evening, not with any grand feast, Their resources were still modest, but with a quiet sense of triumph and gratitude. Ilara baked a special cornbread, and Silas opened a small jar of preserves Martha had made years ago, a treasure he had been saving. As they ate, with Thomas babbling happily in his high chair, another of Silas's constructions, they talked about the future, not with fear, but with a renewed sense of hope and possibility. The incident with the Penwrights, though terrifying, had solidified their bond in a way nothing else could have. It had forced them to articulate their commitment to each other and to Thomas, to stand together against an external threat. They had been tested, and they had not been found wanting. Life on the ranch settled back into its familiar rhythms, but with an underlying current of quiet joy and security. Silas worked his land with a lighter heart, and Ilara tended her home and her son with a newfound confidence. The townsfolk in Harmony Creek, having heard whispers of the wealthy Easton family and Silas Blackwood's staunch defense of his wife and child, treated them with a new respect. The whispers of scandal had faded, replaced by a grudging admiration for the family that had weathered the storm. Mrs. Mize, Henderson even offered Ilara a polite nod on their next visit to town, a small but significant shift. One late summer afternoon, Silas and Ilara sat on the small porch Silas had recently added to the cabin, watching Thomas take his first wobbly steps in the dusty yard. He stumbled, sat down hard, looked up at them with a surprised expression, and then burst into a delighted chuckle. Silas and Ilara laughed with him, their eyes meeting over his head in a look of shared love and amusement. Silas reached for Ilara's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "He's a strong lad," Silas said, his voice filled with pride, "just like his mother." Ilara squeezed his hand, her heart full. "And he has the best father a boy could ask for." The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the prairie sky in brilliant hues of orange, pink, and gold. The air was still and warm, filled with the chirping of crickets and the soft cooing of doves. Thomas, tired from his exertions, leaned against Silas's leg, his small hand clutching his father's trousers. Silas looked at Ilara, his gaze deep and tender. "When you first came here, Ilara," he said softly, "I told you that boy needed a father. I was right, but I didn't know then how much I needed him, how much I needed you." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes. "Oh, Silas." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her work-roughened knuckles. "You brought love back into this house, Ilara. You made it a home again. You gave me a family." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her gaze fixed on their son, who was now trying to pull himself up using Silas's boot. The vast prairie stretched before them, no longer a symbol of isolation, but of boundless possibility, of a future they would face together. The lonely rancher had taken in a mail-order bride pregnant by another, and in doing so, had found not just a helpmeet, but a wife he cherished, and a son he adored. He had said the boy needed a father, but in truth, they had all needed each other, finding in their unlikely union a love that was as strong and resilient as the land itself. He watched Ilara as she gently guided Thomas's hand, her face soft with maternal love, and Silas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he had made the best bargain of his life. He hadn't just given a child a name, he had found his heart, his purpose, his family, under the wide, forgiving sky. The sun dips, painting the prairie in strokes of fire and lavender. Inside the small cabin, a lamp casts a warm glow. Silas watches Ilara, who hums softly as she rocks Thomas, her son, their son. The child's fist is curled around her finger. Silas had once thought his life was about enduring the silence. Now, it's filled with a quiet music he never knew he was missing. He said the boy needed a father, and it was true. But what he, Silas Blackwood, the lonely rancher, found in that pronouncement was a love that redefined his world, a wife whose strength became his own, and a son who carried the future in his innocent gaze. The land outside is vast, but his world, now, is perfectly, wonderfully complete within these four walls. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.